Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And this morning, I'm very happy to bring back to the show Riley Waggaman, who writes under the name of nom de plume, I guess, of Edward Slavsquat. And Riley has been my guest maybe a half dozen times last year. I'm so glad to have you back. And it's very interesting that the events in Georgia have hit the front pages here in the states. At least last week they did. It looked like we were possibly going to have some type of a color revolution. What color do you think that the revolution is going to be if it happens in Georgia?
Oh, that's a great question. They're running out of colors. Maybe they'll go with lime or something. I don't know.
Oh, lime. Oh man, I like lime. I don't want them to use it for a color revolution, but anyway. Well, welcome once again, and I hope everything's going well with you. Other than that, you're still in Tbilisi. I know you'd rather be somewhere else.
Yeah, things are all right. I Things can always be worse. So I'm grateful for the good things. How you doing, John? It's great. It's great to talk to you again. I'm sorry it's been so long. But
I, I know you've been very, very busy, and I was just exploring your work with James Corbett, and
mm,
he's quite, wow, what a legend he is, and I'm so glad to see you getting that kind of reach because he has a huge reach, of course. And I know you're doing well because I read your Substacks, and I have to ask you something. You have an incredibly clever way of phrasing things, which I just love. Is this something you picked up as a 4-year-old, or when did you start getting getting to an Edward Slavsquat level of clever?
well, I don't know if that's very very kind of you. I'm very flattered. I've just been blogging for a really long time. I mean, I started. I guess I really started in college. Actually, this is a funny story. My one of my first gigs was in it was an unpaid, like, I was an unpaid contributor to the Huffington Post, of all places. The Huffington Post had started a college section. This was when the Huffington Post was a big deal.
Hmm.
And I knew some people through some various organizations who are like, oh, you should really, at the time I was very interested in education policy. I don't know why. And they're like, oh, you should really get this Riley Wagman kid. He's a goofy, interesting guy. You should definitely get him to write for your new section. And they let me do it. And I only wrote like two or three pieces for them, but they're actually still some of my favorite things I've ever written because I was just this very sort of bitter college student, and writing about just like how I hated the whole system. And anyway, so I've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. That's what I was trying to say.
That's nice. Yeah, but yeah, obviously people recognized some goofy talent there early on, and that explains, I think, part of the appeal that you have today. Um, well, I titled our show today "Georgia on My Mind." I suppose that's been done before, but each day, Georgia, a song of you comes sweet and clear as moonlight through the pines, and
James
we don't.
Taylor, right? Yeah, there we
Well,
go.
yeah, and Ray Charles and Willie Nelson and many others. But
Oh, of course, of course.
you're Georgia over there where you are. Tell me, let's learn a little bit about it. And first of all, what's the population of Georgia approximately?
I think it's around 3 million, maybe even less. 3 million max.
Yeah, okay. So
So
it's
it's a small place.
yeah, may be comparable to Ireland or maybe one of the U.S. states that doesn't have a huge city in it. Um, so and the people there is it generally do they identify as an ethnicity or is it kind of more of a mixed thing now or how would you describe the makeup of the population?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I mean, most of them are Georgians, but there's a lot of Armenians. There's a lot of influence there's many, like, from Iran, who are from Iranian descent. I mean, it's a pretty interesting place. I mean, you're bordering many different countries of, uh, you know, very different ancient cultures, basically. And while Georgia is Orthodox Christian, I mean, it borders several large Muslim states, and so they definitely have there's definitely a Muslim minority here. But in general, it's it's a sort of Christian, socially conservative. I would have to say, uh, what's the politically correct term now? Like not underdeveloped, but what is the word they use now for like country that's not exactly first world yet? We were definitely there
You mean the
in
third
Georgia.
world cesspool? Is that what you're looking for?
John, politically correct. No, I mean, it's a lovely country, but you go outside of Tbilisi, and I mean, we're talking about. I mean, it's very very modest. Let's put that way. Very rural, very simple. But the people are very friendly. There's excellent wine, incredible food, pretty good weather sometimes. So
And is it a place where things like the flag and the nation mean something? I love the flag. It's so it's red and white, and it's got the big red cross in the middle and four crosses. I don't know if you want to call them Maltese or Templar crosses or whatever you want to call them, but they are symbolic of the Saint George,
yeah,
going back to when he slayed the dragon back in Russia before England figured out that he was really an Englishman.
that's
So,
interesting.
um, what is the appeal of nationality and patriotism in Georgia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think like in many parts of the world, it is a little bit politically schizophrenic here. I mean, for example, you'll have, like I said, it is socially conservative. Um, but at the same time, you have both parties, both the ruling party currently in power, which is called Georgian Dream, and the opposition, which is, I guess you would say, more liberal. And they both want EU integration. I mean, both the ruling party and the opposition support Georgia's application application for EU candidacy status, I guess is what it's called. So the sort of and I'm sure that there are smaller parties that are much more sort of nationalistic and against European integration, and probably also, in many ways, I'm guessing, want to make sure that there's not too much political influence or economic influence from Russia at the same time. But it's just a very interesting part of the world because you do have well, first of all, it's a very small country. So what does it mean to be a country of 3 million people that's uber nationalistic? Is that even possible? Like, who do you have to whose feet do you have to rub to like have your own country, right? So I think that in Georgia, the question has always been, are we going to look towards Brussels? Are we going to try to, iron things over with Moscow? And obviously, there's a lot of history there, both good and bad. And so I think that's what I think is playing out right now. Particularly over the last month, we definitely saw how it's clear that in Tbilisi there is this sort of urban liberal elite. It's the main hub for these sort of NGOs that all are backed by the usual suspects, John. USAID, NED, Soros, the U.S. Embassy in Tbilisi. So yeah, it's a very strange situation. And again, behind all this, both parties want to join the EU. So it's like, why can't we all just get along? I don't get it.
Well, yeah, is that a cultural thing? I would think it would be more just a desperate economic thing of that as you mentioned, most of the people live in the countryside. That means there's not a whole lot of great jobs and great growth potential as a tiny, virtually landlocked country. And
Yeah.
Therefore, they would it not just be natural to reach out to the wealthiest nation states that are around you, as opposed to it being something that they want to reject Russia and the Russian culture? It, what it does, it gives us a little bit of a microcosm to look at the whole big world issues in in a kind of a jewel box situation where we can look. What do you think about the attitude towards Russia in Georgia?
That's a good question. It really, I mean, you see the whole range. In Tbilisi, it's going to be almost universally negative, especially among young people who I think have, I mean, I don't know what the right word is, but I'm just going to say indoctrinated by, this idea that all the usual stuff that you're going to get anywhere basically in the West, that Russia is the enemy, that, Putin is this, unspeakable crime of a human being, that all the basic stuff. And because of the because of the war from 2008, which Georgia has to take at least 50% responsibility for that one, there's still a lot of bad blood, I would have to say. uh, that being said, Georgia has also benefited tremendously economically from what has been occurring over the last year. You have an absolutely huge, like a true exodus of very highly skilled, mostly IT individuals, young IT professionals coming from St. Petersburg and Moscow and other cities to Tbilisi to work for probably various reasons. Some to avoid mobilizations, others so that they can actually be connected to Swift. And this has created, I mean, Tbilisi is basically is in some ways is almost as expensive as Moscow now, which is really horrifying. I mean, I was hoping that I could take it easy here in Tbilisi, and prices are going up like across the board for everything, especially rent. It's been incredible. I mean, I'd never thought that I would have to pay Moscow prices to live in Tbilisi. It's like, why would I have to do that? But I have to. And now, if you go out to the countryside, I think that people are much more pragmatic, and they're not as, um, you know, they're not so extreme about it, and they may not. It may not be that they support Russia, but they're like neutral. Like, yeah, Russians, there's no problem. And a lot of these older Georgians are what there's a term for this. It's a little bit rude, but it's not meant to be. It's called a vatnik, which is a vatnik is a broom in Russian, but it's someone who is sort of an older generation who lived in the Soviet Union and is sort of nostalgic for the Soviet Union, you know? And so I think that you definitely have you definitely have Georgian Vatniks who, feel like their real home was the Soviet Union, and don't necessarily love Russia, the Russian Federation, which is a much different country than the Soviet Union was, but you know, don't have any particular ill will against Russia. So,
So why would there have been an attempt to launch a color style revolution on behalf, I guess, of the same people that support the NGOs and all that? It sounds like there's a lot of very similar foreign influence that happens before any color revolution. But why was the government in trouble from these folks?
that's another. It's a mystery, John. I still don't really understand why these things happened. And it was just a few days of unrest. Few, as I've said in the past, and also I interviewed an acquaintance, a friend, who said the same thing. What happened in Tbilisi really wasn't any different than your average weekend in Paris, basically. Like a cop car was flipped over, there were some water cannons, things like that. But basically, allegedly, the whole thing was over this um, legislation that would have required organizations that receive more than 20% of their funding from, a foreign government or some sort of foreign NGO to register as an agent of foreign influence. And both the United States and Russia have laws that are very similar to what Georgia proposed. So why should this be a problem? Well, for whatever reason, all of these, NGOs, or I guess they call themselves CSOs now, civil society organizations,
Oh,
did not like this. The U.S. Embassy in Georgia did not like it. The European Union didn't like it. All the usual suspects were saying that this was it was some sort of Russian bill. It was designed to, torment the forward-looking, democratic-loving, organizations that are helping Georgia grow. All the usual languages used. This is against European values. So the bill was withdrawn. Why the bill was introduced and why it would spark this kind of rage, this momentary rage, is still something that I ask everyone I know, like, what do you think? What's actually going on here? Nobody quite understands what what motivated the bill. Really, was it that Georgian Dream, the ruling party, just sort of got nervous? Did they start looking, over their shoulder and see all these Western-funded NGOs and start, worrying about their own sort of political security? Or, I don't know. I don't know, John.
other than the influx of Russian intellectual capital, which is kind of a bad news for Putin, obviously, um, the war in Ukraine has, it must have affected Georgia in many ways. Could you tell us what the war in Ukraine means to Georgia and Georgian people?
Well, a lot of Georgians, I mean, I would have to say in Tbilisi, probably the vast majority are very pro-Ukraine. And there's Ukrainian flags everywhere in the city, everywhere. You leave, interestingly enough, if you leave Tbilisi, I was in the mountains at a place called, well, I can't even remember the name now. But anyway, I was in the mountains, the Georgia mountains, about a week ago. And it's about a 3-hour drive outside of Georgia. And once you leave the city, the flags are gone. But I think that a lot of Georgians are still bitter about 2008, which, again, as I mentioned, Georgia has to take at least partial responsibility for that conflict, that mercifully short conflict. But um, they support Ukraine, probably just out of bitterness towards Russia. Um, at the same time, there's no real talk. There's been these sort of rumors floating around, or these suggestions that maybe Georgia will open up a second front against Russia by trying to reclaim, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This is not a serious proposal. I've never, and the people in Tbilisi who are the most rah-rah Ukraine are not the kind of people who are going to pick up a Kalashnikov and try to fight Russia. I mean, it would be a suicidal thing to do. Even in Russia's, I would have to say, even though Russia's quite preoccupied militarily right now, it would be absolute madness. As far as I know, there's no mainstream politician in Georgia who's even suggesting it. But yeah, it's weird. It's weird sort of being in a place, having lived in Russia for so long and now coming here and seeing Ukrainian flags everywhere. And there's lots of anti-Russia graffiti, for example, in Tbilisi. So it's interesting sort of living on the other side of the fence. I'm not used to it. I'm not used to it.
I had no understanding of how dramatic that is, and yeah, it is the total separate separate view of the world from the view from Moscow. I see what you're saying. Um, and would you give us a brief summary of the 2008 war? Because I personally had forgotten the details of it. As you say, it didn't last very long, and I think it would be beneficial, since it's an issue with the minds of the people there, that we understand it a little better.
God, you're gonna put me in a tight spot here, John. I don't even know if I remember the war that well, but basically, if I remember correctly, and probably I'm not, I'm gonna get slammed by someone in watching this, but there was there were Russian there was some sort of Russian peacekeeping force, I believe, in Abkhazia, and just Georgia decided to start kicking things off. I mean, well, first of all, I mean, we should before all that happened, there had been conflicts between the Georgian military and in these two breakaway regions,
Abkhazia is one, and what's the other?
South Ossetia. If I
South
if I
Ossetia.
remember correctly, I hope I am. My gosh. But anyway,
Well, I'm going to put up on the screen the Wikipedia article because it has a map there, and we can just maybe it'll be helpful
yeah,
to people.
yeah.
Um,
But anyway, I mean, basically, what ended up happening is that Mikhail Saakashvili, who was at the time Prime Minister of Georgia, yeah, took it upon himself, allegedly, to, as we understand it, launch some sort of military adventurism in these regions. And, Russia intervened. And I think that this was done. I think Saakashvili did this under the assumption that NATO would have his back, and it didn't. And there's
okay.
that famous video. I don't know if you know of it, if you recall it, but he was live on the BBC, and he's sitting there with his phone, and he's eating his tie. He's so nervous. And there was an assumption. I mean, Russia could have just occupied Tbilisi. It really was. It's really not that far from. They could have done it, but if, as I recall, the war lasted maybe okay, 5 days. I was going to say 72 hours, but a little longer than that, and it was all over. And if I, you know, I even remember reading in depth about this, and even there was an EU commission, I remember, that investigated like the causes of this conflict, and they put a great deal of blame on the Georgian side. So that obviously says a lot coming from the EU.
It sure does sound like somebody in NATO whispered something to somebody to say, "Hey, do this, and we got your back." Kind of like what is going on with Zelensky. It might be. Um,
Yeah,
how
or Washington with Saddam Hussein, who, as if I remember correctly, was given reassurances that Washington would be totally okay with Saddam Hussein attacking Kuwait, and then of course he learned
Yeah,
that wasn't true.
wasn't her first name was April. I think it was like April Haynes or something like that that had come out and got quoted all over the place saying, the US would be okay with you can have
Right,
Kuwait. Sure, here, Saddam, you take Kuwait.
right, right.
And, and then whack.
It's
Oh boy.
terrible.
We
Terrible.
got to try all of our special, super duper secret weapons, so
Yeah,
that was
yeah,
a
exactly. It was a great day for Raytheon stockholders.
yes, and I don't know if you heard it, but I think it's probably true that they had found some way to broadcast something that actually penetrates the skull and tells the soldiers that Allah is wants them to lay down their arms. They
I
they
I
pulled
believe it. That sounds very believable to me.
they pulled
Sounds like
something
something.
like that, and they keep trying. They'll always keep trying these crazy ideas, and not to mention biological weapons and things like that. Any issues of biological warfare in Georgia?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Yay!
Um, you know,
That's good. That's good. One place in the
I'm,
world.
well, there are, allegedly Georgia does have these biological labs that receive some amount of support or funding from the U.S. government.
Uh-oh.
But I don't know. I haven't really looked. To be honest, I haven't looked too deeply into this. But
Yeah, okay.
um, yeah, yeah.
And well, let's flip that around and ask you this. So what have you been looking deeply into recently?
What have I been looking deeply into recently? Well,
Probably
I
Russia, right?
started. Yeah, I mean, I've started. I think that the conversation around like Russia's sort of like not just economy, but sort of what is happening. Well, okay, what's happening economically with Russia? It's just become very cartoonish. Like the debate, it's like on one side, it's always been, oh, like Russia is about to collapse, blah blah blah, and then on the other side, you have these people who are claiming that the sanctions did nothing, that Russia is, flourishing economically. And so I've decided to take it upon myself to start writing about trying to create a more realistic picture of what's happening economically in Russia. So I published something recently on that, talking about import substitution. And I hope to touch on, well, as many topics as are necessary in order to help people decide for themselves, what's actually going on economically in Russia right now. So.
And tell us about import substitution. I'm sure that has to do with the sanctions. And I read your Substack article on this that you publish under the name of Edward Squat on Substack for people's reference, and a very interesting and detailed article about that. But uh, that term doesn't have a lot of meaning to us. So explain what is meant by that.
Yeah, well, it's not unique to Russia, but this concept of import substitution just means that you want to reduce dependency on foreign imports by creating like your own, supporting your own domestic production of, these products that you're importing.
Sure.
So this is something that Russia had actually been pursuing, at least on paper, for at least the last decade, but it really took center. Uh, they decided to really, uh, you know, prioritize this policy in 2014 after the Ukraine crisis really kicked off. And there, if you recall, there was this sanctions war where the EU, uh, at the, basically taking orders from Washington, imposed numerous sanctions on Russia. And so, in response, Russia banned a lot of EU food imports. And so, as a result, Russia, for example, there was a lot of discussion about, no more European cheese in Russia and how tragic this was, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as a result, the idea here was that Russia would start becoming more self reliant, not to the point where they expected to produce everything themselves, obviously. And I don't even think that would be beneficial or even logical, but to just reduce their reliance on foreign imports, because clearly, we have many trusted Western partners that maybe are not so trustworthy and, can't keep a trade agreement, et cetera, et cetera. So when we reached this next stage in the Ukraine crisis in February 2022, there was much discussion in Russia about, well, okay, is import substitution working? Is this happening? Really? And well, as my article pointed out, a lot of people think that it really didn't work out very well. That being said, in certain sectors, like in agriculture, especially, actually, Russia is doing very, very well. And in fact, if it's still, I don't know if it's still true, but I believe it is. It's actually the world's number one wheat exporter. In many other sectors, though, especially electronics and IT, like software, is um, is really lagging behind. And this actually is not just about becoming more self-reliant, but it becomes a national security issue. If you have to rely on, Microsoft Office or whatever, you have to rely on Microsoft to run your computers, and you're, allegedly in an existential conflict with the collective West. I mean, that's a very scary thing,
It
right?
is. It's crazy. I mean,
So, yeah,
how in the world could a sovereign country use Microsoft products? No,
exactly.
talk about cheese. They got more holes than Swiss cheese. Wow.
Exactly, exactly. So it's not even an. I mean, on some level, obviously, it's an economic policy, but it is a national security um, topic as well. It's a national security issue, and unfortunately, um, in some very key areas, Russia has apparently fallen short. Does this mean that it's all over for Russia and, woe is us? No. But I think that there are these certain realities that people need to recognize. It is spoken about quite openly in Russia. So, I just wanted to highlight, the good and the bad, what is actually happening on the ground. And so I hope to do the same, try to inject a little nuance into the debate on other topics, economy related topics regarding Russia.
Well, we had major international news headlines when President or Comrade Xi visited President Putin this past week, and that, of course, we could talk about in whatever detail you like. But it seems to me that the Western uh, well, the people, the people, let's just say the people that are on my side are hoping that China and Russia can build something real to compete with, if not necessarily take down, but at least to compete with the Western financial system. And that seems to be the hope of a lot of folks in this country that, yeah, we can have, if Russia and China can have sovereignty, then maybe we'll get sovereignty too here in the United States, because it does seem to me that the effort of these NGOs, USAID, and then all of the official alphabet letters agencies, the OGAs, are absolutely against the preservation of sovereignty in the United States, and would love to see sovereignty destroyed around the world in favor of the one world currency, the one world banking system, digital IDs, and a medical system that is almost fascistic. Um, that seems to be the goal here, not sovereignty. Well, that's my point of view. What's yours?
Look, I mean, in my humble view of things, uh, it would be wonderful if countries could, not be a slave to, you know, the dollar, to any particular country, Washington or anyone else, and start, having the ability to make decisions in their own interest without having to worry about, getting drone bombed or whatever, right? Um, Look, what China and Russia are doing, okay, yeah, I mean, it seems that they are trying to increase economic integration, political integration, possibly even military cooperation. Although I feel like uh, I feel like there were hopes that China would be more proactive with helping Russia militarily, and as far as as I understand it, that really we're not actually, at least officially, that didn't really pan out. Um, at least not during this meeting. But look, Russia is launching its digital ruble on April 1st. It's months, maybe years ahead of the United States and many other countries.
Wait,
And
did they celebrate April Fool's Day in Russia?
there you go, right? And the wonderful April Fool's gift for everyone.
Sorry.
Um, it's and unfortunately, I have this, at least from my reading, my understanding of the situation is that there's no reason to believe that the digital ruble will be, you know, it's going to be the same kind of CBDC that we see that's being planned for the European Union or the United States or the UK or wherever. You're going to be able to track every transaction. You're going to be able to program the money. You can turn it on and off. As far as I understand it, and here I'm referencing articles that I've read, not just from sort of patriotic alt media, but even from, uh, interestingly enough, there's a website called Strategic Culture Foundation, which is sort of, it's a very sort of pro-Russia platform in multiple languages. it's funded by the Russian government. And if you read, though, the Russian language version, it's much more, for whatever reason, it's much more liberal in the sense that people are able to actually discuss topics in much more depth and be a little bit more critical. There was an article published by a Russian economist in Strategic Culture Foundation talking about how the digital ruble would be disastrous for Russia, you know. And, you know, we can say I'm assuming, although I haven't read as much about it to be honest, that it's going to be the same in China. And China already, as we know, has has implemented all sorts of you know, antivirus measures, which apparently some of them have been rescinded, but China is way ahead of other people in the sort of technocratic, you know, in this brave technocratic future that apparently we are all marching towards. So, you know, look, if it's going to be this situation where it's the collective West versus Russia, China, or BRICS, or whatever you want to call it, I guess my question is the you know the way the how do you even put it? Maybe, you know, maybe the you have aesthetic differences, but the foundations of both of these systems, I think, are going to be very much the same, which is that there's going to be unheard of, previously unheard of controls over all aspects of life. I do believe that biosecurity, this sort of endless safetyism, you know, is here to stay, more or less. And so one has to wonder, you know, is what Russia and China, what they are endorsing, what they are trying to usher in, does that actually save us from these, you know, the worst aspects of this sort of, you know, Davos inspired dystopia? And I have to admit, John, I don't know if that's the case. And it maybe in some respects you could even argue that Russia and China are are much further ahead than some Western countries in this respect when it comes to this sort of, you know, this digital control grid. So I hate to be such a party pooper, but that's just my reading.
Well, it wasn't a party, and I was hoping, I was kind of hoping that you'd give me some good news. But on the other hand, that's more or less the way I see it too. And especially, you've done a lot of great work reporting on the Russian policy towards COVID and the jabs and AstraZeneca. What's the current status of that in Russia?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, AstraZeneca, as far as I know, is still doing business in Russia. You know, I believe it was like I want to say in April 2020. So shortly after the special military operation started, the Russian health ministry actually announced that it was planning on approving the AstraZeneca COVID injection for, you know, for use inside Russia, which I don't think ever went anywhere. But from the Sputnik V side, we have recently Alexander Ginsburg, the famed scientist of the Gamaleya Center, which allegedly developed Sputnik V, recently came out with this COVID injection for children ages 6 to 11. And they're, you know, for whatever reason, they're still chugging ahead with this stuff, even though it's very obvious in, I mean, especially among, it must be obvious to most Russians at this point that this medical procedure is not necessary. It's very likely, could be very likely dangerous, and the coercive methods that have been used to, you know, get needles into arms, I think is just totally anti-human, you know. And I'm sure, and I know that many Russians feel similarly. You know, there was actually a very funny, well, I don't know if funny is the right word, but recently there was I read some Russian news article citing this chief physician of the St. Petersburg Infectious Disease Hospital. And he was talking about the average COVID patient in his hospital, and he said that they're all 80 years old or over, like on average, and have, a laundry list of health problems. And COVID is like either between the fifth or 10th, like actual problem that's requiring them to be hospitalized. So it's like, why do we need injections for this at this point? Like, what is going on? It's madness. It's
Well,
really,
you're preaching to the choir here, of course, and this is that this choir seems to be, not that big of a chorus right now, in terms of the world. I think in America, there's a lot of people that would say the same as you just did. I mean, a whole lot, but they're not getting any time on television. They're not getting any support by the political parties. And this, once again, here it is, the masses of the world are being excluded from the political process. What's going to happen?
yeah,
it, it's the same. It's that whole historical cycle that you know the people in the back room with the black coats on that sit around and plan everything have been, watching it play out. I'm getting more and more skeptical of the reality that we're being spoon fed every day, and more confident that I'm right, that there is some kind of a I don't know, a secret empire, or something behind the scenes. People call it the deep state, and it's hard to get people to think about that. If you even open that subject, most people will just, well, change the channel. I don't want to hear that. Give me my Netflix. So, what do you think? Let's say, what about Georgia? Are people in the country of Georgia getting skeptical?
that's a really good. I've never breached the subject with a Georgian. I'm too, I guess I'm just. You have
Well,
to. I guess I have to drink. I had to drink a lot of cha-cha with some Georgian one night and just
you don't
put
want
it
to die
to him
on that.
straight.
You don't want to die on that
Yeah,
hill.
I don't. Yeah, but you know, I mean, thankfully, I haven't. Masks are basically non-existent here now. But Georgia did what everyone else did. They introduced the QR codes. They, I believe, to some extent, did have some sort of compulsory vaccination for certain, sectors, business sectors. Um, yeah, I mean, it's an international scam, and I agree. There clearly there's some level of coordination going on here. Coordination going on here. I don't know if deep state is even the right word because it's international.
Yeah,
It's international,
yeah.
and that's what's the most depressing part of it, right? Is this idea where, oh well, okay, maybe the United States has been infiltrated by these space lizards, but we have so and so to like expose the lies. None of these countries are doing that though, John. Like, let's just be honest with ourselves. Um, if Russia really wanted to, to give the United States or the collective West a hard time, all they would have to do is just expose this, public health fraud as the scam that it is. But they would never do that because they're totally on board with it, right? They're all, you know, they're all singing the same tune. They're all marching to the same drum beat on this issue, and it makes you. It's terrifying, but it's something that I think people have to, accept and process and just think like, well, what does that mean? Like, how deep does this go? And who's really pulling the strings at this point? I don't know. I don't know.
Well, the good news is a lot of people are working on that question right now. A whole lot of people, and a number of good people with good instincts and intellects, and putting the evidence out there. And you're one of them, and we appreciate your writing very much. Um, in in that sense, the idea of Five Eyes,
Mm.
the intelligence services of the world kind of colluding together. in a James Bond type of evil type of collusion. I think that's there's a lot of truth in James Bond, and I think there's a lot of truth in the idea of these intelligence services around the world that, hey, I think that I think the CIA and the KGB were trading scientists back and forth, and weapons plans and nuclear stuff and biological and chemical. I think they were trading it back and forth in the 50s, and all of this implies to me that while it looks like they're working for the United States, it looks like they're working for Russia, it looks like they're working for a sovereign entity. In fact, those entities might just be pass-through organizations from a hidden hand behind the scenes, and it sure does look more and more like that every day to me. Yeah, I wish I could say, rah rah Russia or rah rah China, like
Yeah.
a number of my colleagues and friends do. There's a great deal of support for China here in this country, and uh, a pushback against the warmongers of America is probably a lot bigger than the support for the warmongers against China, at least right now. So we tend to. I mean, I see a lot of people, that would just tell you, "Hey, look at China. They brought 200 million people out of poverty. They've gotten rid of. They've got these terrific trains. Look at the cities; they're beautiful. And China is on the grow, and they're getting away from the dollar. They're depleting their dollar assets, and as a result of that, people here are like saying, "Well, China, why can't we just live with China?" But China is still a communist country. It's totalitarian in nature. It will force the people to do whatever, and we've seen them push them through all kinds of uh, horrific scenarios involving, you know, um, spraying cities and putting people in hazmat suits and dragging the children from the parents and killing the pets and all these horrible things that were associated with their response to COVID. So the key to opening people's minds, I think, really is, and this is just coming to me right now. It really is tied to how well people do in exposing the scam you referred to. Then
Yeah.
the
And
governments would
look,
have
yeah.
to then the governments would have to actually talk to the people and say, "Well, yeah, well, we did this because, Doctor this said to do it, and, now we see that he was working for the evil, you know, Octopus Corporation," right?
Octopus Corporation. I like that.
Yes, that's who it is. The tentacles are everywhere.
I totally agree with you, John. And just to be very clear, obviously, I wish no ill will towards China or the Chinese people, but I think that there is this tendency, especially in the West, where people, um, you know, the grass is always greener on the other side, right? And actually, it's not. This is not a phenomenon that is unique to Americans or any country, but if you feel tyrannized and you feel like you're being lied to or manipulated, and your solution to this problem or your answer is being more like China, that doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, that just, in many ways, it seems like you are asking to make the situation much, much worse. And okay, yeah, China does have like some very amazing infrastructure. That's true, but I mean, you have to look at all the factors here, right? Like, uh, okay, maybe let's just be honest here. I mean, you could just call it as a nicer looking cage, right?
A
And
gilded cage.
yeah, in my opinion, as an American and as someone who has chosen not to leave the United States, I still, every time I talk to an American who idolizes Russia or China, I say, look, you should also appreciate the wonderful things that the United States has, and not become so despondent that you're looking towards China or Russia which have many admirable qualities. And there's many beautiful things about these both of these very ancient cultures. But the United States has wonderful traditions. In my opinion, I mean the things that the United States should represent, and the way that you you really shouldn't take some of these things for granted, is what I'm saying. This expectation towards, and I understand, like, well, you talk about free speech, but we don't really have free speech. Trust me, it's 1,000 times worse in China, and to a lesser extent Russia. So like if you're someone who is very worried about you know encroachment from Big Brother, looking towards China and Russia doesn't make any sense to me. It just objectively doesn't make any sense. And
Thank
it
you.
doesn't mean that we can't have good relations with China and Russia, that we can't be friends with them, that we obviously shouldn't be fighting insane proxy wars with apparently now depleted uranium shells. I mean, this is madness. We should all be praying for peace, but let's not idolize countries simply because they're not the United States, right? And that seems to be what's happening on a certain level. It's like anything but us. Well, don't be so sure. Don't be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for.
That is sound advice, my friend, and I would echo it myself. It's absolutely the greatest hope for mankind on earth, as paraphrasing President Lincoln, and the last best hope of mankind. And by that he means mankind as it should be, as it free and creative, thinking, productive, and helpful people that are going to make the future even better than the present is. And so many of our forces are just trying to pull it apart, from
Yep.
every aspect of life. Pull it apart,
Yep.
pull it apart. And that's the old Hegelian dialectic, right?
Yes.
You spoke about the population of Georgia and how, um, half of them are way over here and half of them are way over there. That's media, that's control, that's psychological manipulation through the amazing think tanks that have developed in the 20th century around, psychology and propaganda, media, and the incredible amount of control over the financial system that has just developed in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century. I suppose we could all blame the Federal Reserve for it, but for whatever reason, um, we don't have any control over how much a dollar is worth anymore. It's completely set by the banks. And if they say, a dollar, is now you're going to need $10 to get a gallon of gas instead of four, what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? There's nothing we can do about it because we lost control over our financial system. And that, I think, is probably true around the world. Would you agree with that as regards to Russia? Does Russia have control of its financial system, or are the bankers at Rothschild sitting in their cubicles running things behind the scenes?
Well, who's actually running things is obviously an open question, but Russia has a IMF obedient central bank, just like every country on earth, basically.
Okay.
I believe, if I remember correctly, I read an article recently talking about how I think over the last either 15 or 10 years, the ruble's value or inflation has increased 100%. 100%. Like, so it's the same. It's the same with everything. It's the same with everything.
Do I understand that
Everything.
correct? You're saying the ruble has doubled in value.
No, no, sorry. It has decreased in value.
Okay. Yeah, because
Yeah,
you
that
weren't
way.
smiling when you said it, but I thought, wait a minute. Okay. Okay, I got it. So the ruble has suffered inflation to the extent of now being worth half what it was worth a year ago,
No, 10 years ago. 10 years
10 years
ago.
ago.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So
I think that this is in relation to, just like purchasing power, I guess is what you say. If I'm remembering the article, but basically what I'm trying to say is it's the same problem, right? You have a dollar today, and a year from now, it's 70 cents, right? And it's the same in Russia, absolutely, without a doubt. And yeah, it's what is this? This is some kind of it's wage slavery, basically, you know. And how do you get out of this system? How do we get back to something that is sane and human? It's a global problem. It's a global phenomenon. Absolutely.
Thomas Jefferson, the point was the great speaker against wage slavery, and he had a solution. His solution was, a little revolution every 20 years or so is not a bad thing, And that's to me is bad. I don't want a revolution. I don't want war. I don't want to have to become a military type, and I don't want to see people killed over this. But I think we have an information war that's going on right now, and you know, your contribution is really much appreciated by me and my audience and everybody else that you have hooked up with. I'm glad to see you getting a lot of play with James Corbett and a number of other great presenters. So keep up the good work, Riley. Thank you very, very much for being with us this morning. And anything you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
No, thanks for having me back on, John. I hope we'll talk again soon. It's been fun.
Okay, thanks everybody for joining us in the chat room, and thanks for everybody that will be watching it on the replay. Uh, Very good. All the rest of the day, I hope, is wonderful for you, Riley, and I do hope
Thank
that
you, John.
you get back to Moscow soon. All the best. Bye now.